Imagine your country being invaded and ending up with parts of it under foreign military occupation, then being told the invader could be your friend. You'd say that was crazy, but that's the reality Georgians are facing today. And worst of all, they believe it. Kind of. Despite being invaded and partly occupied by Russia, and being the most pro-EU nation in the region, Georgians just democratically sabotaged their own interests. In this video, I'm going to show how Russia waged a relentless information war on Georgia's Western aspirations. Then we're going to look at the similar path that Armenia is on, examine Armenia's vulnerabilities, and finally offer you some tools to counter it. Georgia's Western path truly fascinates me. They had a pro-democracy revolution in 2003 and have been pursuing NATO and EU integration since. In a 2008 referendum, 77% of Georgians voted to join NATO. NATO denied them, but promised future membership amid strong objections from Russia. That same year, Russia invaded and occupied 20% of Georgian territory, which it continues to hold to this day. Officially, the war was to protect the Russian citizens in Georgia, but slightly less officially, it was to stop NATO expansion on Russia's southern border. Still, in the face of military aggression, Georgians persisted on their western path, with ambitions now stronger than ever. Following the invasion, the European Union monitoring mission started patrolling Georgia's de facto borders. In 2009, US-Georgia Charter on Strategic Partnership was signed. In 2011, NATO designated Georgia as an aspirant country. In 2014, Georgia signed a free trade agreement with the EU. In 2016, the NATO-Georgia Joint Training Center was established. Starting 2017, Georgian nationals started enjoying visa-free travel to the EU Schengen countries. In 2022, Georgia applied for EU membership and a year later were granted candidate status. By all accounts, it looked like Georgia was set to become the first EU, maybe even first NATO member in the Caucasus. But then, it all came crashing down. After Georgian parliament passed the controversial Russian-inspired Foreign Agents Bill in 2024, the EU suspended Georgia's membership plans, proposed suspending visa-free travel for their citizens, withheld military aid, and threatened sanctions. The US also suspended aid to Georgia and threatened sanctions as well. But this poll from just a year ago showed Georgians still overwhelmingly favored joining NATO and EU, even if that came at the cost of cutting trade relations with Russia. Yet, protests fizzled out, Georgians went back to their lives with their EU dreams dead in the water. The political party responsible for passing the bill that sabotaged the Georgian dream, ironically called Georgian Dream, are still winning in the polls ahead of their upcoming election. So what the heck happened? This was what Georgians said they wanted the most, and it was jeopardized in a matter of months. Why aren't Georgians angrier? Quick disclaimer before we proceed. This video will focus on Russian use of information warfare. I realize my own biases lean towards the West, and a pro-Russian person could argue that Western propaganda is to blame for destabilizing the region. They of course are wrong, but that's not the point of this video. My hope is that by exposing how information warfare functions and offering tools to counter it, by the end of the video we will all be better equipped to resist it regardless of what direction it's coming from or our own political biases. That said, I'd like to introduce you to a Soviet military strategy known as reflexive control. Reflexive control is used to manipulate an adversary's decision-making process. First, you figure out what you want your opponent to do. So let's assume we're Russia. Ideally, we could flip Georgians from being pro-NATO to being pro-Russia. But that's not very realistic, especially while we still occupy Georgian territory. So we need to break this down into smaller, more manageable steps. If we could somehow just weaken Georgia's determination towards the West, it would make them less likely to fight against policies that go against their interests. And if things do happen to get ugly, it could scare off other countries in the region from pursuing a similar path. So, that's our predetermined action. Get Georgians to reduce their commitment to the West. Step 2. We feed them information carefully designed to exploit their decision-making process, gradually influencing them towards our predetermined action. Now, Georgians have been overwhelmingly anti-Russia since they see Russia as an occupying force. That is not a good look. We need to reframe this narrative. This report from 2019 analyzes the three-layered systems of anti-Western propaganda in Georgia. All of the following narratives have been pushed by either the ruling party, pro-Russian party, the Georgian Orthodox Church, or by the Russian government directly. I'm gonna be showing some examples on the screen. Feel free to pause if you want to read, and as always, I'll put a link to the full report in the video references. Here we go. System 1. Tap into Georgians' fears, like fear of irritating Russia by integrating with NATO, and push the narrative that the 2008 Russian invasion was provoked by the US. There happens to be a biolab in Georgia that's partly funded by the US government. Start conspiracy theories about it spreading viruses and epidemics. Finally, fear of Western liberalism eroding Georgian identity and Christian values. System 2. Establish despair. Push the idea that the West cannot protect Georgia. Look at how they failed to confront Russia in 2008. Also, the idea that democracy is a fiction. The West interferes in Georgian politics just like the Soviets did. The key here is for Georgians to feel like they have no hope for a better future with the West. And System 3. Offer solutions. Promote neutrality. Neutrality avoids provocation and ensures stability. Encourage more economic integration with Russia, which offers even more stability. Remind people that Russia shares Christian values, and that can help counter the morally degrading Western liberalism. Finally, advocate for direct dialogue with Russia to resolve territorial issues, turning Russia from an occupier into a cooperative neighbor. To make things easier for Russia, half of Georgians cited TV as their main source of information, and almost half of Georgians watch foreign television channels, among which Russian channels are the most watched. Russia had all these avenues available and spent years hammering these narratives into the Georgian psyche. And as Georgians got tired of chasing the Western promises, they gradually lost the will to resist measures that ultimately sabotaged their initial goal. Effectively, Russia eliminated NATO from their southern border without firing a single bullet. Georgians are not dumb or indifferent to their cause. They are human beings with fears and biases, and that makes them susceptible to influence. To be clear, I believe some of this is valid criticism of the West. It is frustrating how slow the democratic world is to act. Otherwise, Georgia could have gotten what they wanted years ago. I mean, what the heck is aspirant country? But it's very important to avoid false equivalencies between valid criticisms of the West and the actions of an occupying force like Russia. But I don't want to get sidetracked here. I will talk more about solutions at the end of the video. For now, let's see if a similar tactic can be deployed in Armenia. Well, of course not. Armenians are superhuman and can see through such shenanigans. I guess we could end the video right here and I could go back to building my Minecraft base. But just to cover all our bases, let's take a look at some interesting trends in Armenia. Armenia had their pro-democracy revolution in 2018. Azerbaijan invaded Artsakh in 2020, which ended in its joint occupation with Russia. In the face of military aggression, Armenians persisted on their Western path and ratified a trade agreement with the EU in 2021. In 2023, European Union missions started patrolling borders of Armenia, and joint US-Armenia military exercises started being held in Armenia. In 2024, Armenia signed a strategic partnership with the US and began visa liberalization talks with the EU. At a Copenhagen Democracy Summit, Armenian Prime Minister stated that he would like Armenia to become a member of the European Union this year. Then, the EU approved the first ever military aid to Armenia. Now, let's imagine we're playing a game. It's a strategy game. Let's say we are playing as some fictional made-up country. Let's call this country Rusbakistan. As Rusbakistan, we have a strong military backed by an oil-based economy. Our population has poor living standards, but that shouldn't be a problem as long as we control the narrative and keep them distracted with an external enemy, which should be easy since we're playing as an authoritarian government. Our opponent has picked Armenia. Militarily, we have the upper hand, but due to several other conflicts in recent Uzbekistan history, we have used up all our diplomacy points and cannot outright attack Armenia just yet. Knowing this, Armenia has been capitalizing on time by expanding their defense ties with other countries to enhance their security capabilities. If successful, this could present a problem for us for two main reasons. First, a foreign influence would challenge our long-standing dominance in our sphere of influence. And second, new defense ties could shift the balance of power in favor of Armenia, making the impending conflict between us more problematic. Can we, as Uzbekistan, use reflexive control to achieve the following goals? 1. Get Armenians to sabotage their own efforts to expand its security and economy ties. 2. Get Armenians to inflict as much damage to themselves as possible. And since Armenia's got one thing going for it that Georgia doesn't, with its much larger diaspora and a recent influx of 100,000 Armenians from Artsakh, 3. Drive a wedge between Armenians from Armenia and Armenians from the diaspora and Artsakh. Perhaps not an easy task, but after seeing what Russia has achieved in Georgia, this should be a walk in the park for Uzbekistan. So let's see. What do Armenians care about the most? According to this 2023 poll, 47% of Armenians believe that national security is one of the country's main problems. Armenians do also care about the economy, but since they have one of the fastest growing economies in the last decade, we need to suppress this topic as much as possible. The security problem, on the other hand, by nature, provides an ideal environment for narratives that can exploit fears about safety and stability. So we need to downplay Armenia's successes as much as possible and make sure there's always an alarming headline that is threatening their safety. If there isn't one, either create one by encouraging some border skirmishes or just lie about it. Now, there have already been a couple of anti-government protests in Armenia for this very reason, but they haven't garnered enough support, so they fizzled out both times. We want to grow the number of protesters and make sure they arrive to the protests angry. You see, the best predictor for an authoritarian takeover is polarization and dissatisfaction. Ideally, we get Armenians so riled up that they protest and violently install a strongman who will dismantle civil liberties. If we can get them to do that, it would hit all three of our objectives and completely derail their Western integration. And with no more military aid from the EU, no more military exercises with the US, no new defense contracts with NATO countries, who do you think Armenians turn to then? Okay, so these were all hypotheticals in my imaginary game. Is any of this happening in the real world? Take a look at this message written by a pro-Russian Armenian blogger. He says the Armenian Prime Minister will not allow Armenians from Artsakh to enter Armenia because he is afraid of them, and that the government of Artsakh and Russia are negotiating with Azerbaijan. This part of the message spreads fear of the Armenian government by likening it to an enemy, then offers a Russian solution depicting Russia as a benevolent protector instead of Azerbaijan's collaborator in ethnic cleansing. It also lumps Artsakh with Russia, pitting them against the incompetent Armenians. He then calls on Armenians to protest against the government and accuses those who do not join the protest as being responsible for the surrender of Artsakh and the genocide of Armenians of Artsakh. At first glance, this looks like a concerned call for protest, but this message does something a lot more insidious. It simplifies the narrative by entirely removing the middle ground, meaning you either join the protest or you are a traitor, no different than the enemy. Of course, we all know now that this was a complete lie. Armenians from Artsakh were not prevented from coming to Armenia. But it doesn't matter. Disinformation like this tears at the fabric of society and eliminates any possibility of a dialogue between groups, which increases the probability of disorder. It should come as no surprise then that this message was shared by Russian state propagandist Margarita Simonova and seen by 360,000 people. Speaking of the Kremlin, 52% of Armenians turn to Russian TV channels for sources of information and 20% of Armenians to Russian internet sources. That's a pretty juicy gift to Russia. An independent Russian media outlet in exile revealed that a guideline was prepared which provided instructions to Russian state media on how to cover Azerbaijan's attacks. The main directive was to put the blame on Armenia and its relations with the West. Russian parliamentarians had also been instructed to blame the Armenian Prime Minister as the main person responsible for the escalations due to his criticism of Russia. I found countless posts on pro-Russian channels that go through the same three systems as we saw in Georgia. I will show them briefly, feel free to pause if you're feeling brave enough to read some, but what's important here is to note these narratives so we can spot them when it starts to seep into the mainstream in the coming years. Fear: the Armenian government is an enemy of its people on par with Azerbaijan. Despair: the West isn't going to do anything to help Armenia. Solution: Russia is the only logical protector. As a bonus, these posts also divide Armenians from Artsakh and Rylap emotions. No matter if we're talking about Artsakh, Syunik, a village or a farm, it's never just a piece of land. It's always the last stand against Turkification of the rest of Armenia. Many of these messages were seen by hundreds of thousands of people. Then, as Armenia expanded its security ties with NATO countries, came the posts minimizing these deals. For example, claiming a deal reached with Italy in 2023 was made up to instill a false sense of safety in the Armenian people, and questioning Armenia's decision to buy APCs and radars from France, calling them old and defunct, unable to help Armenian troops in the event of an attack. We see a similar message in Azerbaijani media, that the West is not interested in peace and stability in Armenia and just wants to start a new war. Azerbaijani media also regularly spreads disinformation, such as Armenia using EU's military aid to buy weapons from Iran in an effort to discredit Armenia in the eyes of the West. This news was entirely fabricated and refuted by both Armenia and Iran. In fact, Azerbaijan and Russia regularly put out near identical statements condemning Armenia's Western integration. Other Russian channels accused the EU border monitoring mission in Armenia and Georgia of spying on Russia and accusing the Armenian Prime Minister of giving French intelligence officers free rein in the country. Even though Azerbaijani attacks occurred in areas where Russian border guards prevented the EU monitors from carrying out their work, factuality doesn't matter in information warfare. As long as they keep hammering these narratives, they will start to seep into the Armenian psyche. Then, all they need is an opportunity when emotions are the highest, like an incentivized Azerbaijani military escalation to get Armenians to self-sabotage. And that is why the US intervened after Azerbaijan's invasion in 2022. So, is it working? So-so. Armenians are polarized, but it doesn't feel as bad as it seems in the US or even some European countries. And the percentage of Armenians who think the country is headed in the wrong direction rose after the 2020 war, but has been fluctuating around the same level since. But this doesn't mean that Armenia is in the clear, because remember Georgia, reflexive control operates over a long period of time, and now is the time for Armenians to remain vigilant. By now, I hope it's becoming clear to you why NATO considers cyberspace as one of its domains of warfare. It's not just about cyber attacks. When done right, it can help win wars without firing a single bullet. Initially, I also wanted to talk about troll farms, but that turned out to be a whole other rabbit hole, so I've decided to split these up into separate videos, so stay tuned for that. But for now, what can we do to counter this information war? Number 1. Always check the source. It could be fake news or it could be real news. Either way, it's good to put information in context with its source. Number 2, beware of fake images, audio, and videos, especially now that anything can be AI generated. Number 3, knowing is half the battle. Understand that information warfare is real and it affects every actor of society down to the individual. Every person has their fears and biases and they can be exploited. And if what you thought didn't matter or couldn't be influenced, there wouldn't be billions of dollars being spent to influence it. It is important for you to accept that this affects your party and more importantly, that it affects you. Number 4, proactive intentional unity. Understand that your mind thinks tribally, and when somebody disagrees with you, it's easy to think that something must be wrong with their mind. Surely somebody who thinks like that cannot be a normal human being like you. They are zombies or sheep, a Turkish traitor or a Russian spy. Now, I hesitate to use the word unity because it's often misunderstood as never disagreeing about anything. But on the contrary, unity is about extending patience and grace to those with whom you disagree. Refrain from dehumanizing your online brother, and when somebody dehumanizes you, respond with kindness. No matter what group you identify with, your tribal identity is being used against you, and the art of disagreeing well is an excellent countermeasure. We need an essential core of the population to understand these ideals so that we can have a bottom-up shift and create an environment that fosters a healthy debate of ideas free of vitriol. Number 5, check the tone. Pay attention to how the content you are consuming online is trying to make you feel. Is it trying to trigger a strong emotional response like fear or anger? Nobody wants to pay for the news, so the media is financially incentivized to use alarming headlines to drive clicks. Be conscious of liking and sharing such content. Notice how it is affecting your mind and how you treat other people. Demand accurate reporting from your information sources, creating a market condition for such media to thrive within. Which brings us to number 6, encourage media literacy. Never trust a single source of information. I am also a single source of information, and even though I try to be upfront about my biases, I am still biased. Consult third-party fact-checkers like CivilNet Check for Armenian-related news in English. Practice finding mental blind spots and audit your own beliefs. Develop the attention span to track issues without being distracted by the overwhelming amount of noise that is coming from every direction to confuse you. For example, 2 months ago, Armenia and Azerbaijan agreed on demarcating a part of the border, which meant returning 4 villages to Azerbaijan. Using the Ground News website or mobile app, I can see how this news was covered by various outlets across the political spectrum. They have not paid me to say this, but I used Ground News during my research for the last 2 videos and found it to be a useful tool, so I reached out to them to ask for an affiliate link specifically for this video. One thing I find very useful is checking how various governments are reporting this news. For example, American and German media used the headline "Armenia returns 4 border villages to Azerbaijan," emphasizing that there was some kind of an agreement, whereas Turkish and Russian state media write Azerbaijan takes control of 4 villages, implying a more aggressive stance. Both of these headlines are technically true, but it's interesting to see how different outlets frame the same event to influence public perception. If that sounds interesting to you, use my link to sign up and you'd get a 15% off any of their plans, and I get a little kickback. But more importantly, it supports holding news media accountable. If you want to learn more about the controversial bill that Georgia passed that cost them their EU bid, I have a video about that. And as I mentioned, troll farms were supposed to be part of this video, but it was getting too long and now it's going to be its own video, so subscribe so you don't miss that. Glory to Rusbakistan.